You threw away $50,000! I screamed at my mother as she stood frozen in the doorway of her pristine kitchen in Meadowcrest Heights, her manicured hands still clutching the Hermès purse I'd bought her for Christmas. The entire family gathering had come to a screeching halt, my sister Evangeline dropping her wine glass, my brother-in-law Marcus rushing the kids out of earshot, my father Theodore standing behind Mom like a deer caught in headlights. Even the catered Sunday brunch from Bellacorte Bistro sat untouched on the granite countertops as everyone stared at me in absolute shock. That vintage jewelry box you tossed in the garbage last week? The one with the ugly old trinkets? Do you have any idea what you just threw away? My mother, Vivian Blackwood, 62 years old, and every inch the picture of Upper East Side sophistication, even here in our family home in Willow Grove, Connecticut, just stared at me with that blank expression she perfected years ago when she didn't want to deal with uncomfortable truths. "Cordelia, darling," she said in that cool, dismissive tone that had been cutting me down for 3 decades, "I have no idea what you're talking about, and please lower your voice. The neighbors will hear." The neighbors? Even now, even in this moment of revelation, she was worried about appearances. "The jewelry box, Mother," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and heartbreak that had been building for months. "The one Grandmama Rosalind left me, the one with the Art Deco pieces inside, the one you said was cluttering up your guest room and belonged in the trash because it didn't match your new interior design scheme." I watched her face carefully, looking for any flicker of recognition, any sign that she remembered the conversation we'd had just 7 days ago when she'd called me at my marketing firm, Zenith Creative Solutions, interrupting a crucial client presentation to inform me that she was spring cleaning and that several items I'd stored at their house needed to go. "Oh," she said, and I caught the tiniest flash of something, maybe memory, maybe concern, before her expression returned to its default setting of polite indifference. "That old thing. Cordelia, it was falling apart. The wood was warped, and those pieces inside were so tarnished they looked like costume jewelry from a thrift store. I was doing you a favor by disposing of it." A favor? She thought throwing away $50,000 worth of vintage Cartier, Tiffany, and Van Cleef & Arpels pieces was a favor? But here's what my mother didn't know, what none of my family sitting in that sun-drenched dining room in Meadowcrest Heights knew as they watched this confrontation unfold. The monetary value of those pieces wasn't what had me shaking with fury. The $50,000 wasn't what was breaking my heart. The real value of what she'd thrown away was something far more precious, far more irreplaceable, and the truth about why I'd been storing my most treasured possessions at her house instead of in my own beautiful apartment in Harbor District was about to destroy every assumption they'd made about my life, my choices, and my relationship with the family that was supposed to love and protect me. What they didn't know was that I hadn't been keeping that jewelry box at Mom's house for convenience or storage space. I'd been hiding it there for protection. Protection from someone who'd been systematically destroying everything I valued, everything I'd worked for, everything that connected me to the grandmother who'd raised me when my own mother couldn't be bothered. And now, because of Mom's careless favor, that protection had failed in the most devastating way possible. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me start at the beginning, because this story isn't really about jewelry or money or even about my mother's stunning lack of consideration for anything that matters to me. This story is about what happens when you spend your entire adult life trying to protect people who don't even realize they need protecting, and what happens when you finally, desperately stop. My name is Cordelia Blackwood, though everyone calls me Cora, and I'm 34 years old. I live in a gorgeous 2-bedroom apartment on Harbor District's waterfront with floor-to-ceiling windows that look out over Willow Grove Bay and a walk-in closet that most women would kill for. I drive a silver BMW that I bought with my own money, vacation in places like Santorini and the French Riviera, and run the creative department at one of Connecticut's most prestigious marketing agencies. By every external measure, I'm successful, independent, and living the life most women my age dream about. What I haven't told my family, what I've been carefully hiding from them for the past 18 months, is that my beautiful life has been slowly, methodically destroyed by the man I was supposed to marry. His name is Jonathan Ashford, and when I met him 2 years ago at a charity gala for the Willow Grove Children's Foundation, he seemed like everything I'd been looking for. Tall, handsome, successful in his own right as a real estate developer, charming in that effortless way that makes you feel like you're the only person in the room. He wore Tom Ford suits like they were made for him, drove a Porsche that he'd bought with cash, and had the kind of old money Connecticut background that my social climbing mother immediately approved of. Our first date was at Lumiere, the French restaurant downtown that requires reservations months in advance. He ordered wine that cost more per bottle than most people spend on groceries in a week, and he talked about his plans to expand his development company into the New York market with the kind of confidence that made everything seem possible. He asked thoughtful questions about my work, remembered details from conversations we'd had at the gala, and when he walked me to my car at the end of the evening, he kissed my hand instead of trying to get me into his bed. I thought I'd found a gentleman. What I'd actually found was a predator with exceptionally good manners. The thing about emotional and financial abuse is that it doesn't announce itself with dramatic gestures or obvious warning signs. It creeps in slowly, disguised as love, concern, and protection. It starts with small things that seem caring rather than controlling. Jonathan didn't immediately try to isolate me from my friends or take over my finances. Instead, he gradually, methodically created a web of dependence and manipulation that was so subtle I didn't even realize I was trapped until it was almost too late. It started with gifts. Beautiful, expensive gifts that came with just the slightest suggestion that I owed him something in return. A diamond tennis bracelet for our 3-month anniversary, presented with the casual comment that he hoped I'd wear it to his company's holiday party because it would mean so much to have you there looking stunning. A weekend getaway to a luxury spa in the Berkshires, booked without consulting my schedule, with the gentle implication that if I really cared about our relationship, I'd find a way to make it work. Each gift came with invisible strings attached, invisible debts that I was expected to repay with compliance, with gratitude, with the gradual surrender of my independence. 6 months into our relationship, Jonathan suggested I move in with him. His penthouse apartment in Pinnacle Towers was certainly more luxurious than my place: marble countertops, a private elevator, a view that stretched from the harbor to the mountains. Why pay rent on 2 places when we're spending every night together anyway? He asked, and it seemed so logical, so romantic, so practical. What I didn't realize was that moving in with him meant moving away from my support system, my independence, my ability to maintain boundaries. Within weeks of combining our living situations, Jonathan began making subtle suggestions about how I could optimize my life. Maybe I didn't need to go out with my girlfriends from college quite so often. After all, we had each other, and wasn't our relationship more important than maintaining friendships with people who didn't really understand what we had together? Maybe I could save money by canceling my gym membership at Equinox and using the fitness center in our building instead. It was more convenient, more private, and he'd love to work out together. Never mind that it meant I'd no longer have that hour of time each day that was entirely my own, that place where I could clear my head and maintain my physical and mental health independent of his influence. Maybe I could ask for more flexibility in my work schedule so we could travel together more often. His business required frequent trips to potential development sites, and wouldn't it be romantic if I could come along? Never mind that it would mean missing important client meetings, turning down projects that could advance my career, and gradually becoming seen as less committed to my job. Each suggestion was presented with love, with logic, with the kind of reasoning that made me feel selfish for resisting. After all, he was talking about building a life together. Wasn't that what people in serious relationships did? Wasn't compromise the foundation of lasting love? But here's the insidious thing about this kind of manipulation. It's not really compromise when only one person is doing the compromising. Jonathan never canceled his golf games with clients to spend time with me. He never gave up his boys' nights out or his solo weekend trips to his family's house in Martha's Vineyard. He never adjusted his work schedule or turned down opportunities for my sake. The compromise was always mine to make, and it was always presented as proof of my love, my commitment, my worthiness of the life he was offering me. The financial control came next, so gradually that I almost didn't notice it happening. It started with Jonathan offering to pay for things: dinner at expensive restaurants, weekend trips, shopping excursions to places like Nordstrom and Bergdorf Goodman, where he'd encourage me to buy things I would never have purchased for myself. "I want to spoil you," he'd say, pulling out his black American Express card before I could even reach for my wallet. "You work so hard. You deserve beautiful things." At first, it felt generous, romantic, like being cherished and valued. But slowly, I began to realize that every purchase came with expectations, with the subtle implication that I owed him something in return. The expensive dinner meant I should be grateful enough to go along with his weekend plans, even if they conflicted with things I'd wanted to do. The designer dress meant I should wear it to his business events and smile prettily while he showed me off to his colleagues and clients. More importantly, the more he paid for things, the more he felt entitled to have opinions about how I spent my own money. Why was I wasting money on expensive coffee when we had a perfectly good espresso machine at home? Why did I need to buy birthday gifts for my girlfriends when I barely saw them anymore anyway? Why was I contributing to my retirement account when we were planning a future together, and his investments were performing so much better than mine? Gradually, insidiously, my financial independence eroded. Not because he'd taken my money or prevented me from working, but because he'd created a dynamic where my spending was subject to his approval, where my financial choices were seen as reflections of my commitment to our relationship. The emotional manipulation was even more subtle. Jonathan was never overtly cruel, never obviously abusive. Instead, he used my own love for him, my own desire to be a good partner, against me. He became a master of the disappointed sigh, the hurt expression, the gentle comment that made me question my own judgment and priorities. When I wanted to visit my college roommate Penelope in Boston for her birthday, Jonathan didn't forbid me to go. Instead, he mentioned that it was the same weekend as his company's annual investor dinner, and while of course I should do what I thought was right, he'd been looking forward to having me there to meet some important potential business partners. He'd already told them so much about me, and he'd hate to disappoint them. But of course my friendship with Penelope was important too, and he'd never want to stand in the way of that. The message was clear. I could choose my friend over him, but it would disappoint him, damage his business relationships, and prove that I didn't prioritize our future together. It was my choice, but one option was clearly wrong. When I mentioned that I missed my weekly dinners with my sister Evangeline, Jonathan agreed that family was important. But he also pointed out that Evangeline had never really liked him. Surely I'd noticed the way she looked at him during family gatherings, the subtle comments she made about our relationship. Maybe she was jealous of my happiness, or maybe she just didn't understand what it meant to be in a mature, committed relationship. He'd never ask me to choose between him and my family, but it hurt him to see how Evangeline's negativity was affecting our relationship. Again, the choice was mine, but the right choice was obvious. This is how it happens. This is how intelligent, successful, independent women end up trapped in relationships that slowly drain away their autonomy, their confidence, their connection to the people and activities that once defined them. It doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen through obvious force. It happens through love, through logic, through the gradual redefinition of normal, until you find yourself living a life you don't recognize, making choices you never thought you'd make, and wondering how you got so far from the person you used to be. By the time I realized what was happening, Jonathan had successfully isolated me from most of my friends, strained my relationship with my family, and created a lifestyle that made me financially and emotionally dependent on him. I was still working, still earning my own money, still maintaining the appearance of independence, But the reality was that every aspect of my life was subject to his approval, his judgment, his subtle manipulation. And the most terrifying part was that I almost didn't see it. Because he never raised his voice, never threatened me, never did anything that would look abusive to an outside observer, I told myself that I was overreacting, that this was just what serious relationships look like, that my discomfort was a sign of my own inability to commit fully to the person I supposedly loved. It took my grandmother's jewelry box to wake me up to what I'd lost and to what I was about to lose forever if I didn't act fast. Grandmama Rosalind had been the most important person in my life growing up. While my mother, Vivienne, was busy with her charity committees and social obligations, Grandmama was the one who picked me up from school, helped me with homework, taught me to bake her famous lemon bars, and listened to all my childhood dreams and fears with the kind of attention that made me feel like I was the most important person in the world. She died 3 years ago, at 91, leaving behind a house full of memories and a collection of vintage jewelry that she'd carefully curated over decades of marriage to my grandfather, Theodore Blackwood Sr., who had made his fortune in shipping before I was born. The jewelry wasn't just valuable, though some pieces certainly were. It was a tangible connection to a woman who'd shown me what unconditional love looked like. When Grandmama's estate was settled, most of her belongings were divided among the family or donated to charity. But she'd specifically left her jewelry collection to me, along with the beautiful Art Deco jewelry box that had belonged to her own grandmother. It wasn't the most expensive thing she owned, but it was the most personal, and she'd told me years before her death that she wanted me to have it because you're the only one who truly appreciates beautiful things, darling. For the first year after her death, I kept the jewelry box in my apartment, displaying some of the pieces in my bedroom and occasionally wearing them to special events. But when Jonathan and I moved in together, everything changed. Suddenly, my grandmother's jewelry became a source of tension in our relationship. Jonathan didn't like the way the jewelry box looked in our bedroom. It was too old-fashioned, too cluttered, too inconsistent with the sleek modern aesthetic he preferred. He never asked me to get rid of it, but he made enough comments about how it didn't fit with our decor that I eventually moved it to the guest room, then to the closet, then finally to my parents' house for temporary storage until we could figure out a better solution.
But the jewelry box wasn't really the issue. The issue was what it represented, a connection to my past, to my identity, to a source of love and validation that existed independent of Jonathan's approval. As long as I had Grandmama's jewelry, I had a tangible reminder of who I'd been before I met him, of the woman who'd been confident and independent and worthy of love just as she was. And Jonathan, with his predator's instinct for emotional weak spots, understood that my attachment to those pieces represented a threat to his control over my life. He began suggesting that maybe it was time to sell some of the jewelry. We were talking about buying a house together, and the money could go toward our down payment. Wasn't it more important to invest in our future than to hold on to trinkets from the past? Wouldn't Grandma want me to use her gift to build something meaningful with the man I loved? When I resisted, he shifted tactics. Maybe I didn't need to sell all of it, but some of the pieces were so valuable that it made him nervous to have them in the apartment. What if we were robbed? What if there was a fire? Wouldn't it be more responsible to keep them somewhere safe, like a safety deposit box where they'd be protected but not cluttering up our living space? Each suggestion was logical, practical, loving. Each suggestion also moved my most precious possessions further away from my daily life, making it easier for me to forget what I'd once valued, what had once brought me joy and connection to the person I'd been before Jonathan redefined my world. But I wasn't completely blind to what was happening. Some part of me, some stubborn core of self-preservation that Grandma had nurtured during my childhood, recognized that giving up those pieces would mean giving up the last tangible connection to my independent identity. So I compromised. I agreed to move the jewelry box to my parents' house, where it would be safe but still accessible, where I could visit it when I wanted to remember who I'd been before I'd started trying to be who Jonathan wanted me to become. That compromise saved my life. Not literally, but emotionally, spiritually, in every way that mattered. Because 18 months ago, when I finally started to see Jonathan's manipulation for what it was, when I began to understand that love shouldn't require the systematic destruction of everything I'd once valued about myself, I made a plan to leave him. And that plan required resources, financial resources, emotional resources, and the kind of support system that could help me rebuild my life from scratch. The problem was that Jonathan had been so successful in isolating me from my friends and controlling my finances that I didn't have many options. I couldn't just pack up and leave because our lives were so intertwined that he'd see it coming from miles away. I couldn't rely on credit cards or savings accounts that he had access to because he monitored our spending closely and would notice any unusual activity. I couldn't even confide in most of my friends because he'd systematically undermine those relationships until I barely had any left. What I could do was slowly, carefully, quietly liquidate assets that he didn't know about or couldn't access. And the most valuable assets I had were sitting in a jewelry box in my parents' guest room, pieces that Jonathan knew existed but had convinced me to remove from our shared life. Over the course of 6 months, I carefully researched the value of Grandmama's collection. I had pieces appraised, photographed everything for insurance purposes, and identified which items would be easiest to sell quickly without attracting attention. I wasn't planning to sell everything. Many pieces had sentimental value that couldn't be replaced. But I knew that if I needed to disappear quickly, if I needed resources to start over somewhere safe, Grandmama's jewelry could provide the financial foundation for my escape. I also began slowly rebuilding relationships that Jonathan had damaged, reaching out to old friends, strengthening my connection with my sister Evangeline, even taking on freelance projects outside of my regular job to establish income streams that Jonathan couldn't monitor or control. It was delicate work because I couldn't let him see what I was doing, couldn't give him any reason to suspect that I was planning to leave. For 6 months, I lived a double life. On the surface, I was still the devoted girlfriend, still participating in the life Jonathan had designed for us, still playing the role of the woman who'd been gradually molded to meet his expectations. But underneath, I was quietly, methodically preparing for my escape. And then, last week, my mother threw away the foundation of my entire escape plan. I'd been at work when she called, sitting in a client presentation for Hartwell Industries, trying to focus on quarterly marketing strategies while my phone buzzed incessantly in my purse. I ignored it the first 3 times, but when she called a 4th time, I excused myself and stepped into the hallway. Cordelia, darling, I'm doing a bit of spring cleaning, and there are several items you've stored here that really need to go. That old jewelry box of your grandmother's is taking up far too much space in the guest room, and honestly, it doesn't fit with the new decor I'm planning. I'm having Goodwill come tomorrow, so if there's anything you want to keep, you'll need to come get it today.
Hidden in the back of Grandmama's jewelry box, in a secret compartment I'd discovered years ago but hadn't thought about since I was a child, were 3 letters. Letters that Grandmama had written to me before she died. Letters that contained not just her final thoughts and wishes for my future, but information about family finances and legal matters that could change everything for all of us. Letters that Mom had thrown away along with everything else because she couldn't be bothered to look beyond the surface of what she was disposing of. And that's when I realized that this Sunday's family brunch was going to be about more than just telling my mother what her carelessness had cost me. It was going to be about revelations that would change everything for all of us, about secrets that could no longer be protected now that the evidence was sitting in a landfill somewhere in Fairfield County. Because you see, the jewelry box Mom threw away wasn't just my safety net. It was also the hiding place for information that could destroy our family's carefully maintained reputation. Information that I'd been keeping secret for 3 years out of love and loyalty to people who'd never shown me the same consideration. The silence in that pristine Meadowcrest Heights dining room stretched for what felt like hours. My mother, Vivian, still clutching her Hermès purse, finally found her voice. "Cordelia, I don't understand what you're making such a fuss about. It was just old jewelry." "It wasn't just jewelry, Mom," I interrupted, my voice steadier now that the moment of revelation had finally arrived. Hidden in that box were 3 letters. Letters from Grandmama Rosalind that she wrote before she died. Letters that contained information about Dad's real financial situation. I watched my father Theodore's face go pale behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He knew exactly what I was talking about. "You see," I continued, addressing the room, but keeping my eyes on Dad, "Grandmama didn't just leave me jewelry. She left me the truth about why our family really has money. And it's not from Grandpa's shipping business like we've always been told." My sister Evangeline set down her wine glass with shaking hands. "Cora, what are you talking about?" "The money came from Grandmama's first husband, the one nobody ever talks about. The one who died in 1962 and left her everything before she married Grandpa. And according to her letters, Dad has been systematically stealing from that trust fund for the past 15 years to cover his gambling debts." The explosion was immediate. Mom dropped her purse, the contents scattering across the marble floor. Evangeline gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Marcus started hustling the kids out of the room as voices began rising. "That's impossible!" Mom shrieked. "Theodore, tell her that's impossible!" But Dad just sat there, his face gray with defeat, unable to meet anyone's eyes. I continued relentlessly. "Grandmama knew. She'd been watching the account balances, tracking the withdrawals. She was going to expose everything, but she died before she could act. So she left me the evidence, thinking I'd know what to do with it." "And what were you going to do?" Eva whispered. "Protect him. Protect all of you. I was going to quietly help Dad pay back what he'd stolen, use the jewelry money to fix everything without destroying our family's reputation." I laughed bitterly. I spent 3 years keeping his secret, just like I spent 18 months keeping everyone else's secrets while my own life fell apart. I turned to face my mother directly. "But you threw it all away, Mom! The evidence, my escape plan, everything. So now the truth comes out the hard way." "What escape plan?" Jonathan's voice cut through the chaos. I hadn't even heard him come in. "The plan to leave you," I said, turning to face the man who'd spent 2 years systematically destroying my independence. "The plan to use Grandmama's jewelry to fund my new life away from your manipulation and control." His perfectly composed mask finally slipped, revealing the calculating predator underneath. "Cordelia, you're being dramatic. We can work through." "No," I said firmly. "We can't. Because unlike my family, I'm done protecting people who don't deserve protection." I pulled out my phone and showed them the screen. "I've already contacted the FBI about the trust fund theft. And tomorrow, I'm moving back to my old apartment with the security deposit I managed to save from my freelance work." The room erupted into chaos. Mom crying, Dad trying to explain, Evangeline demanding answers, Jonathan threatening legal action. But for the first time in years, I felt completely calm. "You want to know what that jewelry box was really worth?" I said, raising my voice above the noise. "It was worth my freedom. And now that it's gone, I'm taking that freedom anyway." I walked toward the door, then turned back one last time. "Mom, your face when you realize what you threw away, it really is priceless." 6 months later, I'm living in a cozy apartment in Harbor District, running my own marketing consultancy, and dating a kind man who thinks my independence is attractive rather than threatening. Dad is in therapy and making payments on his debt. Jonathan is under investigation for financial fraud at his development company. Turns out I wasn't his only victim. And Mom? She still hasn't apologized for throwing away my grandmother's legacy, but she did hire a lawyer to help Dad navigate the FBI investigation. Sometimes the trash we throw away reveals exactly who we really are.